Hey there, my name's Niandra. Whenever Mercy gets big changes, I like to check in on how she's feeling a week or two later so I can talk about the state she's in and give some thoughts. So I've noticed that these Mercy changes have been really divisive in the community. You have people like Skiesti who really isn't a fan, and then you have others like Andriadic who seems to be enjoying them quite a bit. I'm not here to say anyone is wrong, but I do find the split super interesting, and I'm curious as to what leads players to which side. I do wonder if it has something to do with your thoughts on Season 3 Mercy, where if she did not click with you, you probably like her more now, or maybe it's to do with more general playstyle, where if you were big on micro movements, you're less happy now? I don't know though. For me personally though, my opinion is mixed, which I know is kind of a cop-out. To be fair, there are a handful of good benefits, and it's not like Mercy is unplayable. When I do quick play with friends, she feels perfectly fine. However, in my Grandmaster level competitive matches, I feel more frustrated with Season 4 Mercy than I have with other past iterations. Playing Mercy against an extremely coordinated dive comp where everyone is trying to hunt you down specifically can be pretty rough. I know by saying that I am inviting people to say things like, well, just get better, or that it's a skill issue, which to some extent is definitely true, but what you also have to keep in mind is that Guardian Angel usage is one of Mercy's primary ways of showing skill expression. You had so many micro movements at your disposal and ways of manipulating the cooldown of GA in exchange for less mobility, and while this was harder or a bit weaker in Season 3, it was still doable. However, now in Season 4, that depth is just sort of gone, or so untransparent that it might as well be. It's easy not to notice, but the total cooldown for Guardian Angel can, but not always, end up at a maximum of 3 seconds, which is longer than it was in Season 3, plus we no longer have any increased healing, although I am happy to admit that was miserable to play against. I try to be a very pragmatic person that assumes Blizzard generally won't revert things. I will continue to try my best to adapt to Season 4 Mercy because there are definitely things I need to be doing better, but if we are stuck with this, I at least want changes to the implementation because it leaves a lot to be desired. A couple of days ago, Alex Dawson, who is the lead hero designer, did a live stream chat with Karq and Eva Langwin, and Mercy did get mentioned, which I think is worth looking at. So the first thing that gets mentioned is that the devs think damage boost and res are in a fine place, which I thought by itself was pretty interesting. Everything else brought up though was about Guardian Angel, and Alex basically mentioned 4 core points. They want to keep the ability simple, they recognise the last patch notes were confusing, they don't want to remove skill expression, and while the devs don't want to keep changing GA, they recognise this current iteration is not perfect. I don't want to be that person that asks the devs to communicate more and then rags on them when they do. I also totally get trying so hard to word something clearly you wrap around and it ends up being cryptic like I am a YouTuber. However, I would be lying if I said I wasn't a bit baffled by these dev statements. The way Guardian Angel stays active for longer after certain movements is such an opaque way of doing things. It doesn't keep the ability simple, and it does remove skill expression, and it's not like the devs just stumbled onto this. This method was an active choice that deviates away from how they normally nerf abilities. If nothing else, I just want Guardian Angel to simply have a longer cooldown after you jump instead of staying active. You know, like how everything else works. I try not to compare the abilities of different characters too much because there's so much nuance with it, like heroes have different purposes and one part of their kit may be balanced around other parts and so on. However, I do think it's pretty interesting that the cooldown for GA with movement tech can be up to 3 seconds while Diva's boosters are 4 seconds and, what's another good example? I guess a monkey jump is 5. I've always said that I believe GA's low cooldown is justified because it's teammate dependent, but the gaps between it and others that may have more agency is a good amount smaller in some places. The reason I think this is relevant though is because sometimes it's really hard to tell when Guardian Angel is going to end, which makes planning ahead way harder than it should be. There have been moments where GA's lack of transparency has made it harder to adjust my playstyle against hypermobile characters, Diva and Winston included. Listen, if I mess up my positioning in the middle of a fight, especially one against dive, mental gymnastics is the last thing I need, and it's only going to make me panic more, especially when compared to a more factual timer. It also looks really goofy with very small Guardian Angels because you can have the ability fully finished and you're walking about normally, but the game will still consider it active. As far as I know, no other ability is like this where it can be over and still in use. Personally, I have absolutely no problem with super jump having a longer cooldown, but I would prefer slingshots don't get hit in the crossfire because to me, that is kind of the core of Mercy's movement and one of the funnest parts of her altogether. Although with how they work in Overwatch 2, I recognise that it's extremely hard to separate them. Anyway, moving on, the second big frustration I have comes from how Valkyrie does not reset GA if you activate ult during that extension period. This interaction is not consistent with how these two abilities have always worked and doesn't really make sense. It has definitely tripped me up a few times as well in game, and I'll just kind of be sit there expecting to move. It also sucks because Valk GA is a great emergency tool if you're under pressure and could potentially help with some of the pains I mentioned earlier. The reason it bothers me though is part of a bigger thing. So I noticed this interaction within a few hours of getting access to the Season 4 test server. I brought it up in the CC Discord and got no response. SkiSD then bumped my post and got no response. SkiSD then brought it up a week later and got no response. I then bumped that post and got no response. Let me make this clear, I am not entitled to a reply. I know the devs are working hard as hell to make the best game they can. But like, this also kind of happened in Season 3, which SVB mentioned on his podcast before Season 4 came out.
I was a little bit upset myself, and I can't imagine how they feel when they were in the dev talk, and Alex said something like, oh, you know, we made the Mercy movement change. And, you know, unfortunately had the unintended effect of ruining all her synergies. And I was kind of like listening to this, and I'm like, they told you this like on day one. Like, if you talk to anybody who plays Mercy, they literally told you this like literally day one if you ask them. And they've been screaming and begging on, like, you know, I've seen them on the Content Creator Discord, but in public spheres as well. They've been like, please don't touch the movement. The movement is the fun part. Like,
ultimately, content creators like myself and all the others who give countless pieces of feedback, we are just trying to help. And like, the thing with Mercy is she looks simple on the surface and people love to throw around the no skill thing, but she has so much depth under the hood and intricate synergies that just make her so fun to master. The last thing I want is these aspects dumbed down or lost to unintentional oversight. All that being said though, there are a good handful of positives to Season 4 Mercy. As previously mentioned, if you are not against heavy dive, she generally feels fine, albeit somewhat clunky, which as I've said, I think can be alleviated with some changes. One thing I really like is that pocketing flying heroes is so much easier now because of how often you target them and cancel GA. This I think just feels great and a lot better than Season 3. I've also enjoyed learning where I can get away with simpler movements to keep the cooldown short. For example, I fly to someone who is higher than me, cancel GA, and try to fall in a specific direction instead of slingshotting. Also, keeping sympathetic recovery has been very nice, especially with Valk's constant health regen, which, god, I'm so glad got brought back. As for my thoughts on Valkyrie, I will admit I miss the extra healing so much. Having to adjust from popping ult primarily for safety or damage boost to healing back to damage boost has been such a jerk around. The adjustment was definitely rough at first. I kept popping ult to heal people who would just die anyway, and all I could do was watch. I've always been a big Valkyrie defender. I love it as an ultimate, and I always hated it when people called it a spectator ult, but suddenly it feeling underwhelming was like so upsetting to me. All that being said though, you know, mass damage boost for 15 seconds is pretty strong and the ticks still please the brainworms. In conclusion, I think one of the biggest things though is that a lot of players are just kind of tired of Mercy patch notes and also having to relearn her. These changes usually don't just strictly make her feel better or worse, they usually require Mercy to reevaluate target priority and movement and muscle memory and positioning, and as I've mentioned, I think Mercy mains are generally pretty good at adapting, but I've also noticed that some of them are getting pretty tired. And that is all from me. To be honest, I wasn't sure if I was going to make this video because I've talked about the state of Mercy so much in recent months. I'm constantly worried I'm just being whiny / entitled about it and playing into the whole stereotype of, oh, Mercy mains are never happy. So I really try to be balanced with this one and focus on like the practicality side, if that makes sense. Hope you enjoyed it though, feel free to like and subscribe for more Mercy content, and have a nice day.